Jury back, please be seated. Ms. Meyer, you may proceed.
And just for the record, the hammer in the kitchen sink was agency number 22. The swab of that hammer was agency number 41. The Swiss Army case from the kitchen counter was agency 145. The swabs of that case were 153. The black belt from Richard was 211. The black purse from the garbage can was 156. The red shirt from Richard was 218. The checkbook of Richard and the papers inside were 147. The swab of Richard's checkbook 155, and the cigarettes in the trash can 197. Now, Ms. Wilkerson, since 2015, can you tell the jury just an example of how technology has changed since 2015?
Sure. A good everyday example would be like, think about your cell phone. And it used to way back, you'd only have calls and texts, and now you can look up everything, keep all your planners, and your camera has more megapixels than cameras from 20 years ago in a little box. So like that, the DNA technology has also gotten better in the last few years.
Now, when you're determining how many donors that you put into your database, is this based on your observations when you do your manual work?
Yes.
Is it also based on the 17,000 samples you've run?
Yes.
Now, the numerous items tested for blood, you indicated that you cannot tell animal blood from human blood, but when you test the item for DNA, you're saying that this is human DNA and not dog DNA.
Yes, dog DNA would not show up with my testing.
The testimony about Richard's pants pocket, there was DNA that you did not identify. Was that level high or low?
It was very low amounts. The peaks were very small on the graph.
And that's why there's not enough there to work with, basically?
Why there wasn't enough for me to put it into CODIS.
Defense counsel asked you if DNA stays a long time, and you said in the right conditions. What are the right conditions?
Good conditions for DNA would be climate controlled. Usually cooler is better. Freezing would be ideal. Also good conditions would be things that people don't touch or wipe down a lot. Like steering wheels, as you drive it, if somebody else drives it, they might knock some of the DNA off from the previous driver. So that's not a good condition to keep that there for years and years. It would have to be something that's not being touched or wiped in good, basically climate or weather conditions. If obviously something's getting rained on, it'll wash away, things such as that.
Now, when you're looking at or developing a DNA profile, defense counsel spent some time asking you if you could tell if that DNA profile was blood, air, spit, saliva, so forth. Are you testing to find or locate DNA? Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, I can tell you what DNA was in the sample, and then there are tests for like blood or saliva, but I can't tell you specifically that that DNA came from that body fluid.
And this is especially true when you have a mixed profile.
Yes, I definitely can't tell you which, if there's more than one body fluid or type of DNA there, which one is which person.
So when you develop a DNA profile and it's a mixture, that's when you do your statistics, correct?
Either a match or when there's a mixture, yes.
And the statistics is to give weight to the probability that that DNA belongs to this person.
Yes.
Accurate? Now, when you looked at the hammer and the handle, we saw the profile earlier, those profiles of the unknown, were those high or low?
It was very low peaks. They were all under 200 units high, and it has to be 50 units high for it to even be called a peak in the first place.
Now, did you locate a DNA profile to Mr. Hartung on the hammer?
He's included as a possible contributor to the hammer.
And what weight did you give that?
For the handle, the swabbing of the handle, the observed mixed DNA profile is approximately 130,000 times more likely to occur if the sample originated from Donald Hartung and 2 unrelated individuals than from 3 unrelated individuals.
Did you develop Donald Hartung's DNA, or locate it rather, on the Swiss Army case?
Yes.
And what weight did you assign that?
In this case, it was actually a match, meaning it was this, I pulled out a single source foreign profile, and the match is the observed mixed DNA profile is greater than 700 billion times more likely to occur if the sample originated from Richard Smith and Donald Hartung. That's actually for the whole mixture. Than from Richard Smith and one unrelated individual. The original time I worked it, for the match, the frequency of occurrence for the foreign DNA profile was 1 in 33 million.
Did you locate Donald Hartung's DNA on the checkbook of Richard?
Yes.
And what weight did you assign that?
Okay, for the checkbook, again, there was a mixture and it was assuming Richard. I pulled a complete foreign DNA profile that matched Donald Hartung. And within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, Donald was the source of that.
The black purse from the garbage, did you locate Donald Hartung's DNA there?
Yes.
And what weight did you give that?
So Donald Hartung was included as a possible contributor, and the observed mixed DNA profile was greater than 700 billion times more likely to occur if the sample originated from Voncile and Donald and one unrelated individual than from Voncile and 2 unrelated individuals.
Did you locate Donald Hartung's DNA on Richard's belt?
Yes.
And was that the interior, I believe you said?
I swabbed the interior, yes.
And what weight did you assign that?
I developed a mixture of two individuals. Donald Hartung was included as a possible contributor, and the observed mixed DNA profile is approximately 1.1 billion times more likely to occur if the sample originated from Richard Smith and Donald Hartung than from Richard Smith and an unrelated individual.
And you located Donald Hartung's DNA on the cigarettes, correct?
Yes.
All 5?
Yes.
Were those matches?
Yes.
So what weight do you assign the match for the cigarette?
For the first 4 that weren't reworked, the original weight, we just, at the time when the statistic was greater than 700 billion, we just reported out that they were the source of that DNA profile. And then the one that was reworked with the new technology, he was included as a possible contributor to the mixed DNA profile. The observed mixed DNA profile was greater than 700 billion times more likely to occur if the sample originated from Donald Hartung and one unrelated individual than from from 2 unrelated individuals.
Thank you, Mel. Those are my questions.
Could I ask just one quick follow-up?
Yes.
Ms. Wilkerson, something I didn't understand, or maybe my notes were wrong. On the black belt, Mr. Myers asked you about swabbing the black belt. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Did you swab both the outside and inside of the black belt?
No, I did the inside and then the little narrow edge, like the top and the bottom of the belt.
Okay. And where was the DNA, on the top or the bottom or the inside or where?
I don't know. It was all in the same swab.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Minyard going to be the next witness?
Yes, sir.
I just want to let the audience know, by necessity, autopsy photos are somewhat graphic in nature, so if anyone thinks they're going to react to that, they can step out of the courtroom. All right, call your next witness.
Dr. Minyard?
Good afternoon. Would you raise your right hand, please?
Yes, sir.
Do you swear or affirm the testimony you give with the truth so help you God?
Yes,
Thank you. Please be seated.
thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Will you state your name, please?
Dr. Andy Minyard.
And Dr. Minyard, obviously you're a doctor, but what is your occupation?
I'm the Associate Medical Examiner in District 20, which is in Naples.
In July, August of 2015, where did you work?
I was the Chief Medical Examiner in District 1 here in Pensacola, and includes Escambia, Santa Rosa, Okaloosa, and Walton counties.
And how long did you hold that position before you moved down south?
14 years.
How long have you been a medical doctor?
Since graduating from medical school in 1992.
And how long have you been a medical examiner, either associate or chief?
I began as a deputy coroner, no, actually as an associate medical examiner the year I finished my fellowship training, so that would be since 1999.
And what is your specialty?
Forensic pathology is my specialty, and that was what my last year of training was in, specifically forensic pathology.
Okay. And can you tell the jurors what forensic pathology is?
Forensic pathology is the field of medicine in which the doctor performs post-mortem examinations to determine the cause and manner of death, and the deaths are due to homicides, suicides, accidents, or any other type of unnatural or violent cause of death.
Can you tell the jurors your educational background?
Yes, I graduated from University of Louisville with an undergraduate degree, then also went to medical school. After medical school, I did a 5-year residency in the umbrella heading of pathology. The umbrella heading includes all the different subheadings of pathology. My field of study at that time was anatomic and clinical pathology. After that 5 years was over, I did a 1-year forensic pathology fellowship and then began work as an associate medical examiner. I've also worked in Ohio as a deputy coroner. I'm licensed to practice medicine in the state of Florida.
Are you board certified?
And I'm board certified. That's it, you reminded me. By the American Board of Pathology in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, and forensic pathology.
Now, as part of your duties as a medical examiner, do you perform autopsies?
Yes.
And I know you don't probably keep tick marks, but in your career, approximately how many autopsies have you performed?
When I worked in District 1, we had a very heavy caseload. I would perform up to 400 cases per year. And add that to 20 years. So it's thousands.
Okay. And have you testified previously as an expert?
I have.
Approximately how many times?
Probably hundreds.
And does that include depositions and things of that nature?
Yes.
Okay. Can you describe for the jurors just the basic autopsy procedure?
When a death is called into my office, my investigator would determine whether or not it falls under our jurisdictional guidelines. Those guidelines are actually written out in Florida statutes. If it does fall under our jurisdiction, we take control of the case, we either make a scene visit and then transport the body, or we just bring the body straight in, depending on what kind of case it is. When the body's brought in, the next business day is when the autopsy would be completed, and that's where we unbag the remains, take pictures, a document on autopsy notes of medical therapy, of clothing, injuries, any fluids, that kind of thing. Then all of that is peeled away, almost like a layered onion, and we take more pictures and more documentation till we get down to just what we were born with, which is our bodies without clothing, without medical therapy, without dried fluids, as clean as we can make them. And then that's easier for me to document the external injuries.
Does the, do you do a report after the autopsy?
I do.
And does the report reflect your opinion regarding the cause of death and the manner of death?
Yes.
Besides the autopsy, do you sometimes review any relevant medical records if appropriate?
Yes.
Did you perform autopsies on Richard Smith, John Smith, and Voncile Smith?
Yes.
And were their autopsies all done on the same day?
Yes.
What day was that?
That day was August 1st, 2015.
And when were they found deceased?
They were found July 31st, 2015.
Now, that day difference between when they were found and when you did the autopsy, does that affect anything?
No, the bodies are delivered straight into a cooled storage unit, like a refrigerator. So there should be minimal to any change in the bodies.
And sometimes do you go out to the scenes of homicides?
Yes,
Did you go to the scene in this particular case?
I did.
When did you go?
I went to the scene after the autopsy was performed.
Okay. And what was your purpose of going out in this particular case?
My purpose was to look at the, now that I knew the injuries because I'd already performed the autopsies, I wanted to look at the scene for evidence of where and how they were inflicted. For example, before I did the autopsy, I had no way of knowing that one of the victims had been shot. But once I did the autopsy, I was able to see that one was shot, and then we were able to go out and estimate where that projectile would have been found.
So let's start with John Smith. What was his height?
He was He was 76 inches in height. That's a measured length, and it translates to 6 feet 4 inches.
And what about his weight?
He weighed 293 pounds,
And his age?
47 years.
And when you first saw John Smith, do you do an external examination?
I did.
And did you observe any obvious injuries to John Smith?
Yes, I did.
What did you see?
He had several injuries of his head and obvious injury of the left side of his neck
Okay.
and a smaller injury of his foot.
Were photos taken during the course of John Smith's autopsy?
Yes,
Would they help illustrate or assist your testimony for the jury today?
yes,
Would they also help explain the type of injuries that you saw as well as the number?
yes.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness? Judge, for the record, I previously shown these to Ms. Wilson. Dr. Minyard, I'm going to show you what have been previously marked as State's Exhibits 385 through 392. You'll just take a look at those and see if you recognize them.
Yes,
Okay. And do you recognize those exhibits?
I do.
Are they fair and accurate visuals of the injuries and the locations to John Smith?
Yes, they are.
Judge, at this time, I'd move States 385 through 392 into evidence.
Any objection? No objection. So admitted.
And permission to publish?
You may.
All right, Dr. Minyard, I'm showing you States Exhibit 385. If you could just describe for the jurors what they are looking at here.
This is the facial shot of Mr. John Smith. and you can tell that there's an injury here up on the top of the forehead and some displacement or some distortion of the shape of the top of his head.
Okay. This is State's Exhibit 386.
Here is the top of Mr. Smith's head with the hair still intact. So this is his natural way of wearing his hair, and in the next picture you'll see that I will shave the hair in order to see the wounds better.
This is State's 387.
So here we've got a really nice view of the wounds now. We can really see them well. I've shaved the scalp, and this is a wound, this is a wound, and this is a wound.
Now, have you actually placed gauze or something inside of the wound?
It's possible that I have because it's not very clear, but the skull is usually not this white. It's usually pale yellow. So that might be gauze, just to show you the line edges of the wound itself.
This is State's 388.
The hammer head is seemingly a good match for this center wound. You can see based on the diameter of the hammer head and the diameter of the wound that they do match up.
This is State's 389.
This picture was taken because of the fact that these sort of match up with the back of the hammer, the claw part.
This is 390.
And here's another way that could sort of match up to this wound here, the more centrally located wound.
This is 391.
This is an incised wound made with sharp force or a sharp-edged weapon. You can see the edges are very clean. They're pale, kind of yellow, just like the rest of the skin. So it's not a braided edges, which would make you think more along the lines, well, maybe he was struck with a pipe or a baseball bat. So here you have the nice, clean cut edges.
And is that consistent with some sort of knife?
Yes, it is.
What about this little hole right here?
It's either the tip of the knife as it's inserted this way, poking through here and then being taken back out, or it's a poke as he's entering. So it's either accidentally poked all the way through kind of deal, or a couple of different stabs.
Oops, sorry. This is State's Exhibit 392, and what does this show?
This is the inside of the skull. I've taken off the skull cap, and this is where the injury was, where these fragments came out. And you can see they're sort of circular shaped, and here's one that just sort of was all by itself. Again, consistent with the head of the hammer.
So I want to talk about any interior injuries based on those wounds. First off, how many injuries did John appear to have to the top of his head?
John appeared to have three separate injuries.
And what type of internal injuries did that cause to John Smith?
That caused bleeding on the brain. It caused lacerations of the brain, which are basically cuts of the brain from being smashed with something. And it caused the skull fractures.
Now, the wound to John's neck, what can you tell the jury about that?
The wound to the neck was 3 3/4 inches in length, with a sort of a zigzag reposition outline. A zigzag reposition means that the knife was repositioned, so it was stuck and then it came out, causing two different cuts, causing sort of a zigzag or a Z-shaped line. The depth of the wound was 6.5 inches. There was, I think you saw the smaller incised wound about 1/4 inch away from the main wound, and it hit through the epiglottis, it hit through the the membrane that surrounds the epiglottis, called the thyrohyoid membrane. It's part of the voice box. It crossed the midline and it transected the right common carotid artery, and it penetrated the lateral aspect of the 6th cervical vertebrae. So it didn't puncture all the way through, but it just sort of penetrated.
And is that carotid artery, is that a major artery?
It is.
And you said that was severed?
Correct. That's the artery that you can feel your neck and you can feel the pulse.
What is your opinion as to the cause of death of John Smith?
The cause of death is combined effects of stab wound of neck and blunt impact of head.
And why do you say combined?
I say combined because it's difficult for me to know exactly which part of the wounds that he suffered killed him. It may have actually been a little bit of both, and it's impossible to tease one out from the other.
Would either one of those have caused his death, either injuries to the head or the injury to the throat?
Yes.
And what is your opinion as to the manner of death?
The manner of death is homicide.
Now, did you look at the stomach contents of John Smith during the course of his autopsy?
I did.
And what did John have, if anything?
He had a stomach that was he had 1 liter of material in his stomach, form of food and fluid, and it was corn and green beans. Now there was other stuff in there it mixed that I couldn't tell exactly what it all was, but I at least saw some elements of corn and green beans.
Now, is there any way for you to tell how long before his death John Smith ate corn and green beans?
No, it's a very difficult to determine when someone eats a meal. It's easy for the people that are on Law and Order. They can do it quite well. But in reality, what we're faced with when I do an autopsy and I look at the stomach contents, it's usually a stomach full of mush, and there's no way to determine what it is. Every once in a while, like in this case, I can picture a small piece of food that looks familiar, and I'll be sure to mention that in the body of the report, but for the most part, it's unidentifiable. So when you eat a large meal, you're going to digest that slower. That meal will disappear slower than if you eat a small meal. That meal will disappear faster, and that's just the way of logic. You put more food in your stomach, it's going to take longer for it to work its way through. You put less food in your stomach, it'll work its way through quicker. That being said, if I find food in someone's stomach, does it mean that they ate an extra large meal 5 hours ago, or did they eat a small meal 5 minutes ago? There's no way to tell for me. So that's why gastric time and trying to figure out when the person's last meal was is practically impossible.
Does food digestion vary from person to person?
It does. It varies from person to person. It varies based on your age, based on your weight, based on your health status, based on any medications that you might be taking.
And can you give us maybe the inner and outer limits of how digestion can vary?
It can be very quick. Like I said, under an hour if you eat a very small meal. I'm sure you all have fed babies and they don't drink a lot and they fall asleep, and then they wake up an hour later and their stomach is empty all over again, and you got to go through all that all over again. Versus Thanksgiving meal where you feel full until the next day.
Okay. Could an inner and outer limit be from 2 to 8 hours?
I've seen reports in the literature that say that 8 hours is the upper limit, but that's not to say that it couldn't be 5 minutes longer. But 8 hours is the accepted upper limit of gastric emptying time.
Do you submit toxicology samples for testing as well?
I do.
And did John Smith have anything in his system?
He did.
What did he have?
He had, in his bile, which is the fluid that's in the gallbladder and the liver, he had some diphenhydramine.
What is that?
That's the generic word for Benadryl.
Excuse me. Now, is there anything, excuse me, that you can tell the jury about when the Benadryl was consumed in relation to John's death?
I cannot. I can only say that it was not found, well, I'm not sure it was tested for in the blood, frankly, but based on the fact that the diphenhydramine is positive in the bile, I cannot tell you when he would have taken the Benadryl or how much he would have taken.
So all you can say is that it was in his bile?
In his bile. That's all I can say.
What are defensive wounds?
Defensive wounds are wounds that are on the hands. It's all location, location, location for defensive wounds. That's the only thing that distinguishes them from wounds somewhere else. And that's because we use our hands to deflect an attack.
Could defensive wounds also be on the outside of maybe the forearms?
They could be, yes.
Okay.
And they can even be on the legs and the feet.
Okay, so not limited to just hands.
Correct.
Okay. Did John Smith appear to have any defensive wounds?
He did not. He had a wound on his foot, but it was not anything that I felt was associated with this series of injuries. In fact, the wound on the foot had a scabbed appearance to it, so it had been there for a little bit. It had already started to scab.
Now, the injuries to John's head and to his neck, would those take much force to inflict?
The injuries to the head would be, yes, that would take a lot of force. You have to hit that hammer hard enough to crack the skull. And the skull's not thin, it's pretty thick.
Okay.
The injuries to the neck, most of those are just soft tissue injuries. Vessels are very soft, muscles are soft, skin is soft. So if you have a sharp enough knife, that probably wouldn't take a whole lot of force, but enough force. You can imagine cutting, and I don't mean to be crass, but I compare everything to food. Cutting a piece of steak, it's not with a sharp knife versus a dull knife. It's a lot easier to do when you have a sharp knife. But it still takes some force. But it's not impossible.
Ma'am?
But it's not an impossible amount of force.
Let's move to Voncile Smith. What was her weight?
She was 234 pounds,
And her height?
71.5 inches, which translates to just under 6 feet.
And her age?
And she was 78 years old.
And did you do an external examination of Voncile Smith when you first received her body?
Yes,
And did you observe any obvious injuries?
I did.
What did you see?
She had many injuries around her scalp, her head. She had a stab wound of the left side of her neck, and she had some injuries on her extremities.
Okay. And were photos taken during the course of Voncile Smith's autopsy?
Yes.
No objection, Your Honor.
Judge, at this time, I move states 393 through 400 into evidence.
So admitted.
May I publish, Judge? Dr. Minyard, I'm showing you State's Exhibit 393. If you'll just describe for the jurors what this photo shows.
Yes, this is a picture taken at the scene in the home. You can see the carpeting. And they're showing you her neck, the left side of her neck. This finger is holding up the base of her jaw, and you can see here the incised wound that she has that's very similar to John's.
This is State's Exhibit 394. What does this show?
Now this is a picture of Voncile. This is after I have removed the hair. She had hair, but it was barely holding on. And I think I taught you earlier that the best way for me to see injuries is to get rid of the hair. So that's the first thing I tried to do, is get rid of the hair. Hers came off very easily because she was in a state of decomposition, which is why you see the bloating, the greenish discoloration, the overly smooth texture, and the mottled discoloration of her skin.
Now, why does she look so different at autopsy compared to John?
Theoretically, because she's under more blankets, she's kept a bit warmer. People in the same household that die at the exact same time can decompose at different rates if they're exposed to two different temperatures.
And on the wound to the top of her head, is that gauze that you also may have put in there?
Yeah, probably.
This is State's Exhibit 395. What does this show?
Here you can see the aggregate of wounds on the top of Voncile's head.
This is State's Exhibit 396.
And here is a little bit towards the back of the head.
State's 397.
Again, I've taken off the top of the skull so that you can see the defects that were made, and you can see the clean, almost rounded edges, and if we were to turn it, you would see the beveling pattern.
And what is this area right here?
This area could be a bruise. It looks like it's a bruise with a pale center.
And is that consistent with a hammer strike?
Yes, what happens when the hammer hits, the blood rushes out towards the edges because you're basically flattening this area with the hammer, so you're flattening all the tissues, so they leak their blood into the surrounding tissues, which is why this is such a perfect circle within a red contusion.
Okay. This is State's 398.
And then here you can see the beveling that I was talking about earlier on the fractured pieces that came out from that larger hole.
And what does the beveling tell you?
The beveling, which is this sort of lopsided edge here, indicates that the direction of force was inward, towards the center of her skull, versus outward.
Oops. This is 399. What does this show?
This shows what could be, just looking at it, could be a laceration, or it could be I think I refer to it as a laceration, which is a cut with abraded edges. Now remember, I taught you about the incised wounds made with a knife or a sharp weapon. If it's an incised wound, it would be straight with no redness around the edges.
This is State's Exhibit 400. What does this show?
This shows the dried up pinky. You can see that there's trauma here. It looks like the tip of her pinky has been traumatically amputated.
Now, how many blows or strikes did Voncile have to her head?
Approximately 8.
And when you were talking about her pinky, how do you describe it in your autopsy report? What is the medical language that you describe it?
I say the tip of the left fifth finger is traumatically amputated.
And can you say what caused that wound? Could it have been a hammer? Could it have been a knife? What is your opinion?
In my opinion, it could have been a hammer. It could have been something that may not be that sharp. In other words, not like a razor sharp knife that would leave a nice clean edge, but maybe a dull knife or a pair of scissors. or even a flathead screwdriver.
And the piece of the pinky that's missing, what is going to happen to it over a period of several days?
It will, if it's left at room temperature without fluid, it dries up and shrinks. Just like if you drop a little piece of chicken on your floor, you find it a month later and you can barely recognize it.
Now, I want to talk about the interior injuries to Voncile Smith. What type of injuries did she receive internally from the injuries to her head?
She had the fractures that you've already seen in the skull, and she had subdural hemorrhage, which is bleeding on the brain. And she had the same thing as John, with the brain surface being lacerated.
And what can you tell the jurors about the injury to her neck?
The injury to the left side of the neck extended from the anterior midline to 3.5 inches to the left, so it was 3.5 inches in length. It had a depth of up to 4.5 inches, and it went through the left common carotid artery, and again penetrated but did not perforate the cervical vertebra in the area.
Now, what is your opinion as to Voncile Smith's cause of death?
Voncile cause of death is blunt impact of head.
Okay, and why is that different from John? Why is it not combined like John's was?
I thought at the time that the traumatic amputation of the pinky tip was a blunt force trauma. In other words, that maybe that was a defensive type wound where she put her hand up and was fending off a hammer blow. In theory, then, she's alive as she's suffering the hammer blow. Obviously, she's alive. So once that occurs, then I can say for sure that she's dead after that injury. So this could be post-mortem. The cut on her neck could be after her death, or it could be before her death. But if she's still alive and able to defend herself against a hammer, then it's the hammer actually that kills her.
Now, if you had information at the time of your report that the pinky wound was intentionally inflicted, would that have changed your opinion as to her cause of death?
Yes, I'm assuming you mean intentionally inflicted at a different time than the head attack or the knife attack.
Right.
Yes. Yes, I would have, if I had known that the pinky was something not even related to the beating of the head or the stabbing in the neck, then I would have worded it like John's cause of death and give him combined effects, because at that point I would not be able to tell.
Okay. And what is your opinion as to Voncile Smith's manner of death?
Homicide.
Did you look at the stomach contents of Voncile during her autopsy?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and what did Voncile have in her stomach, if anything?
She had 250 mLs, so she had about a quarter of what John had as far as volume. I described hers as pasty thick fluid, which is basically what everyone's looks like, but I was able to identify some corn kernels.
And again, digestion varies from person to person, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And did you submit any toxicology samples for testing on Voncile Smith?
Yes.
And did she have anything in her system?
Yes, she did.
What did she have?
She also had Benadryl. It was located in her liver. I was unable to obtain bile because of the level of decomposition, or maybe she just didn't have a gallbladder, I forget. So the only thing I was able to obtain as far as specimens on Voncile was her stomach contents, her liver, and a piece of her brain. And the Benadryl came back positive in the liver.
Now, you had mentioned earlier that she had a number of items on top of her. So if she had 19 bags of stuff on top of her as compared to 4 on John and 2 on Richard. Would that explain why she's more decomposed?
Yes.
So let's talk about Richard Smith, please. What was Richard Smith's weight?
Richard weighed 311 pounds.
Okay, and his height?
He was 77 inches in length, which translates to 6'5".
And his age?
He was 49 years old.
And did you do an external examination of Richard Smith when you first received his body?
Yes, I did.
And did you observe any obvious injuries to Richard Smith?
Yes.
What did you see?
He also had an incised wound of the neck on the left side, and I think I'd already mentioned earlier the gunshot wound of his head.
And were photos taken of Richard Smith during the course of his autopsy?
Yes.
No objection, Your Honor.
Judge, at this time, I move states 401 through 410 into evidence without objection. And may I publish? Dr. Minyard, I'm showing you State's Exhibit 401. If you could describe for the jurors what this photo shows.
So here you can see the mottled discoloration of his skin, which is because of the fact, and here's some slipping off, because of the fact that he's decomposing. And here's a dark red abrasion here on the forehead, on the bridge of the nose.
Is it, excuse me, is it possible that a hammer could cause those injuries?
It is, I can't rule out a hammer causing it, but this is not exactly consistent with the pattern of a hammer. Maybe this one, and I'd have to look at the other pictures, the ones that show it
Okay.
a little clearer.
So possible, you just can't say for certain.
Right. I mean, it depends on what surface of the hammer you're actually hitting. The hammer has many different shapes if you go around its surface.
This is State's Exhibit 402.
This is the buccal surface of the lower lip, and you can see the contusion there, which is a bruise.
State's 403.
Here you can see the incised wound of the left side of Richard's neck.
State's 404.
Here is an entrance gunshot wound right here in the helix of the right ear.
State's 405.
This is how it came out of the ear. It tunneled under the skin, which you can almost sort of make out faintly, and then exited here.
State's 406.
This is just a better picture showing you how it hit the back of the ear as it came out and tunneled under the skin to exit. It did not enter the skull.
State's 407.
This is an abrasion, which is a scratch or a scrape of the skin, and that appears to be on the left elbow.
State's 408.
This is the back of the left hand, and you can see that there is an injury here. It looks like a sharp force injury in a typical location for a defensive wound.
State's 409.
Here's a different view of it, but you can see that this is very typical for defensive wounds when you're fighting off someone who has a knife.
And State's 410.
And then this is the shirt that I believe Richard was wearing.
The injury to Richard's neck, what can you tell the jurors about that?
It was 1.5, let's see, it was 2 3/4 inches in length, and it reached a depth up to 2 inches.
Okay. And the path?
And it also had that zigzag outline appearance to show that it was repositioned. And the path went through the common carotid artery on the left, and it went through the thyroid cartilage, which is part of the voice box. And then they hit the lateral cervical vertebrae and the spinal cord. So this one, as opposed to the other two that where the bone blocked the knife, the bone didn't block the knife because he ran into the disc. The disc is much softer material and knives can go through discs. So the knife went through the vertebral disc and actually injured the spinal cord.
And what type of effect is that injury to the spinal cord going to have on Richard?
It was at the level of approximately C4. You can imagine if you break your neck in a diving accident and you break it at C4, you're probably going to lose your legs, or at least movement of your legs and arms, if not all of your arms.
Now, did he have any injuries to his head from the abrasions and the contusions that the jurors just saw?
He had, like we saw in the pictures, he had those big scrapes on his forehead, and he also had a thin layer of bleeding on his brain.
The gunshot wound. This was not, I guess, a fatal or major type wound. Is that correct?
Well, anytime a bullet pierces your skin, I think it's major. But in this case, he may not have died immediately unless it got so close that maybe it caused his brain to swell just from the force of it. But I wouldn't know.
Okay. And is that at least strong enough? I don't know if that's the right legal or medical word, but is it going to stun him, startle him, maybe cause him to go down?
I would think getting shot in the head where the bullet pierces the skin and tunnels underneath the skin is similar to getting struck in the head with a pole. So yes, I would think he could be in pain, he could be startled, he could even drop to the ground, he could even be unconscious. I just don't know.
Now, did you examine the gunshot wound on Richard for soot or gunpowder?
Yes, I did.
And what was your finding?
I saw neither.
Okay, and so what does that mean for your purposes as a medical examiner?
As medical examiners, we place gunshots into 3 range of fire categories. Those categories are close or contact, which is where the weapon is held very close to the skin. There's an intermediate, which is somewhere between a couple inches and a foot. And then there's distant, which is everything over the foot. And the way that we do this is that we look at the skin around the defect on at the site of the injury. If we see black soot, we know that black soot comes out of the end of the weapon, but it dissipates very quickly. So if black soot is on the skin, that means the weapon was held up very close because that black soot was able to come out and stain the skin. If we see gunpowder stippling, we know that the weapon was probably a little further away because gunpowder stippling can travel further than the soot. So an absence of soot and a presence of gunpowder particles on the skin indicates that the weapon was not touching the skin, but it wasn't 3 feet away. In other words, it was that intermediate range. Then there's everything else. No soot, no stippling, just a hole, basically means a distant wound. It could be 1 mile, it could be 11 miles away.
And what about in terms of feet?
Well, in feet. So the contact wound is either held against the skin or very close to the skin. The intermediate wound range, let me back up though and keep in mind these ranges will be different for every type of weapon that is used and every type of ammunition that's used in that weapon. But the intermediate range, I can give you just a rule of thumb is anywhere from a couple inches to a foot or a foot and some inches, 1.5 feet maybe. And then beyond that would be distant.
Now, the bullet trajectory, was there any angling or what was the path that it went that you saw?
The direction went from the decedent's front to back and from his right side to his left.
And what about any angling?
Upward or downward? There was no angling upward. It went straight across with the horizon.
And what is the cause of death, in your opinion, for Richard Smith?
The cause of death for Richard Smith is incised wound of neck.
And why not the gunshot wound?
Again, the gunshot wound, while it may have hurt him and caused symptoms, I can't say that that's what caused his death because there's nothing fatal that I can say occurred because of it. In other words, he didn't lose 3 liters of blood from that wound. He didn't, his brains weren't mushing out. So I can't say that there was really anything that I can dig my feet into and call it that is the cause of death.
Okay. And what is your opinion as to Richard's manner of death?
Homicide.
Did you look at the stomach contents of Richard during the course of his autopsy?
Yes.
And what did Richard have, if anything?
Richard had 100 mLs, so he had just under half of what Voncile had, of thick, pasty tan fluid, and I did see evidence of crinkle fries.
Did you submit toxicology samples for Richard Smith?
Yes.
Did he have anything in his system?
He had lidocaine and metoprolol in his urine.
Okay. And what is metoprolol?
Metoprolol is I think it's a beta blocker that people get for blood pressure.
And what is lidocaine?
Lidocaine is an anesthetic, but it can be used for other things as well.
Did you have medical records reflecting that that Richard Smith was diabetic?
Yes, I have written on his diagnosis sheet that he did have a clinical history of diabetes mellitus.
And can that affect digestion?
It can affect digestion. It can affect gastric emptying time.
So let's talk about time of death.
Okay.
Unless a death is caught on video with a timestamp, or there's an eyewitness with a watch, how easy or difficult is it to pinpoint time of death?
It's impossible to do it with any accuracy.
Now, you said your job is to determine cause of death and manner of death. Is it necessary for you to determine time of death for your purposes as a medical examiner?
No, it's not. Only I will offer a theory on time of death when asked, but it is not within the realm of my duties on every case.
Okay. Now, if we annoying lawyers ask you to kind of help with time of death, what are some things that you look at?
There are a few things that we can use as medical examiners to look at time of death. Rigor mortis is the stiffening of the muscles that has an onset within probably 20 minutes. And so there's a range of rigor mortis timing in a nice room temperature controlled room with your average decedent. The rigor mortis is, again, that stiffening of the muscles. It'll take 12 hours to set it up fully. It then lasts fully for 12 hours, and then it dissipates for 12 hours. So it's a 36-hour range of time. Then there's livor mortis, which is the darkening of the dependent areas of the body after death due to leakage of hemoglobin and from the red blood cells. So that's why it has that sort of purplish, reddish stain to it. There's also, with livor mortis, there's a period where it will blanch, meaning you put your finger in it and it turns white. But then after so many hours have gone by, you put your finger in it and it doesn't change color at all. So there's that time, which is very, people say different times. for that, but 8 hours is a rule of thumb. And then there's the temperature after death. After death, your body will cool, assuming you're in a room that is cooler than body temperature. So at what rate does a body cool? If we knew that answer, we could determine the time of death on everyone. The problem is we don't know the rate at which bodies cool. Different bodies will cool at different rates. And different bodies will cool at different rates inside of different temperature rooms. So if you find yourself dead inside an igloo, your body temperature will cool rapidly. Much more rapidly than a person who finds himself dead in a sauna or an oven. That person's body temperature may never cool because the oven is probably hotter than the body temperature. So there have been many attempts at gauging time of death, guessing time of death, using body temperature, and I'm just going to say it's inaccurate, doesn't work. I have used it simply because these annoying lawyers want me to put out something. So I try to be, here's how I always preface it. The time of death occurred between the time he was last known alive and the time he was found. I can guarantee you that. Anything else, I have no guarantee.
Okay. Was, well, let me ask you this, your sauna example. So if someone died in a sauna and the temperature was 99.6 degrees, is that person's body temperature ever going to change?
No. He becomes like, you know, the saunas have those rocks in there that are hot. That's, he assumes the temperature of everything that's in that room.
Okay. Now, was the body temperature of John Smith taken in this case?
John's body temperature was taken, yes.
And was it helpful in determining time of death for him?
It was not.
Okay. Was the body temperature of Richard Smith taken?
Yes.
And was it helpful in determining the time of death?
It was not.
Now, was the body temperature of Voncile Smith taken?
No.
And why not?
The office had a policy where the body temperatures in decomposed people would not be taken simply because a decomposed body would already have equilibrated with the environmental temperature. So she was considered decomposed because she was obviously more along than John and Richard, so her body temperature was not taken at scene.
Now, the rigor mortis that you talked about and the liver mortis, are each of those factors variable?
Yes, they are variable. So there's, I told you about the 12-hour, 12-hour, 12-hour range for the rigor mortis. Well, even that is affected by many, many different things. Temperature of the room, for example.
And same with the liver mortis?
Yes.
Based on your knowledge in this case, your autopsy and your training and experience, are Richard, John, and Voncile's date of death consistent with Tuesday, July 28, 2015?
I believe so.
Okay. And what were some of the factors that you looked at outside of rigor mortis, liver mortis, and body temperature?
Well, the autopsy, I must step back and say an autopsy is not just cutting a person and looking on the inside. An autopsy includes an investigation into the pre-terminal circumstances. So I knew certain things about the investigation, and one of which was that Voncile had a pill counter. She took every pill in her pill counter except for Tuesday evening. I also knew that there had been a doctor's appointment that had been missed on Wednesday morning.
And Dr. Minyard, did you give a deposition in this case?
Yes.
What was the date of your deposition?
The date of my deposition was December 9th, 2016.
And to your knowledge, was that the first time that you had discussed time of death, body temperatures, things of that nature with the lawyers?
Yes,
Those are my questions. Thank you, ma'am.
you're welcome.
Griffith?
Dr. Minyard,
Yes, sir.
you were previously the pathologist here in Pensacola, right?
That's right.
And you're now working in Naples?
That's correct.
At the time you did the autopsies on the 3 Smiths, you were the medical examiner here, is that right?
That's right.
And you don't know who killed these people?
No, I don't.
And the hammer that Ms. Jensen referred to, you don't know for sure that that's the right hammer?
I do not.
What was the body temperature of Richard when you measured it at the morgue?
It was
I'm
measured,
sorry, at the autopsy.
it was measured on scene,
Okay.
and that temperature was 82.6 degrees.
And what was it on John, on the scene?
On John, at scene, $83.9 degrees.
And you said you didn't take one on Voncile Smith?
That's
Or
correct.
Not you, but your, the people who worked for you.
Correct.
Now, the people that worked for you, they turned over Richard Smith's body, did they not?
I don't specifically recall.
Whether it was the folks that worked for you or someone else, can we agree that Richard Smith was turned over at the crime scene?
Yes, sir.
And it would have been either by your agents or by crime scene?
Yes, sir.
Is it important to make a determination as to what the room temperature is when bodies are discovered?
Yes, it is.
And why is that important?
Well, as we discussed earlier, room temperature will control how quickly or how slowly your body will cool after you die.
And what was the room temperature where these bodies were found?
The room temperature was recorded at 72.2 degrees.
72.2?
Yes, sir.
And do you have any special instrument to make that determination?
No, sir. A thermometer.
With the room temperature of 72.2 degrees, how quickly should bodies cool?
Well, it's not only dependent on room temperature, so I can't answer the question because
What else is it dependent upon?
it depends on how many clothes you have on. It depends on how heavy you are. It depends on if you're on certain medications. It depends on if you've been under extreme stress prior to dying. It depends on your age and your height and your weight.
Okay, in this case, what medication was John on?
I did not bring a list of the medications.
How about Richard?
No, for none of them.
Okay. Now, when you did the autopsy, would you not have been able to determine what medications are on by toxicology?
Yes.
But you just don't have that information?
Well, the toxicology came back for nothing detected except for the diphenhydramine in John,
And what is Diphenhydramine?
the Benadryl,
Okay.
and for Richard, the lidocaine and the metoprolol,
And what is metoprolol?
the beta blocker for high blood pressure,
Okay.
and for Voncile, it was Benadryl in the liver. Oh, and ethanol in the liver as well.
And that's alcohol?
That's alcohol, yes, sir.
If there were any other medications taken, wouldn't they have been reflected either in the blood or in the liver?
Well, that is the theory, yes.
Well, I mean, it is or it isn't.
It depends, I guess, on how long the drug takes to metabolize in the body and how sensitive the tests are at the laboratory.
Okay, and do you have good laboratory tests when you worked here?
The laboratory that we were using is in Gainesville, Florida.
Okay. Was it a good lab?
Yes,
You wouldn't have used it if it wasn't, right?
right.
And if any pills had recently been taken, would they not have been in the stomach content?
Yes, that's accurate. If you take a pill and it's, a few minutes later and then you die and I'm seeing your stomach contents, then yes, there could be pill.
And you didn't find any pills in the stomach contents?
No, I didn't.
And if pills weren't in the stomach contents, then they would have been metabolized?
No, if you're talking to me about a pill and identifying a pill, but a pill can dissolve and not look like a pill anymore. So while I didn't see a pill, the dissolving pill could still be there and I would never know.
Would it at some point not be, when it dissolves, be in the blood or get to the liver?
Well, it dissolves first in the stomach because of the acid in the stomach and the churning, and then it starts to go into the small intestine where absorption would take place. Some does take place in the stomach, but not all.
Do you check for that?
No, there's no way for me to check for that.
Okay. How about in the liver or in the small intestines?
As far as whether or not the drug is,
If there's any drug in,
the only way I can check is to send those specimens off and have them tested at the laboratory.
did you do that in this case?
Did I send the specimens off?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I did.
And did they return with any drugs in any of the organs, other than the ones we've already talked about?
Not other than what we've already talked about.
Okay. When a person dies, and are there various bugs or other creatures that start maggots, that sort of thing, that come from the body?
No, there's not that spontaneous generation of maggots from the body. The bugs have to actually have access to the body to lay their eggs before you'll see a maggot.
Okay, and how long does that take?
Oh, it doesn't take very long, within 24 hours.
And how long till the maggots form?
Well, the fly can lay the eggs on the skin immediately, and then those flies take, depending on what type of species you're talking about, it doesn't take longer than 24 hours for those to hatch into maggots or larvae.
Did you find any maggots on any of these three bodies?
No, I did not.
And as I understand it, if someone dies, and if they're not immediately taken to, I guess, the morgue where it's nice and cold, you're going to have flies land on that body, lay their eggs, which turn into maggots. Is that correct?
Well, if the flies can reach the body, yes.
Okay.
And if there is a fly.
We're in Florida. Are there flies all over?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Have you ever done autopsies on anyone where there has been a family pet who has eaten or chewed on the body?
Yes, sir.
That's fairly common, isn't it?
It's not uncommon. I wouldn't say it's 100% of the time. I would like to think that my cat would not eat me. But there,
in reality, if the cat's hungry,
I've seen animals that hold out. They never do. But then I've seen them go to town too. So it's not every animal.
but it's not unusual for a family pet after some time to chew on a body.
That's right.
And whether they eat it or they nibble it or something, but you've seen animal marks on bodies, right?
Yes, sir.
Did you find any of that on these 3 bodies?
No.
You indicated to me that the room temperature where the bodies were found was 72.2.
72.2, yes, sir.
Okay. It is important, as I understand it, and I obviously could be wrong, but it's important from the perspective of the medical examiner's office that the room temperature be kept the same until your investigators or your agents get finished with looking at the body, doing whatever they do with the bodies, and then removing the bodies. Is that correct?
My investigators are not in charge of the scene.
But
So
they-
we really don't have a say in that.
Well, you want it to be the same as when the bodies are discovered, don't you? I mean, isn't that preferable?
I want it to be recorded, but I certainly don't want to make people work in 90-degree temperatures when it's easy to put them at 70-degree temperatures. As long as it's recorded and have a picture of it at 90, then I would hate for my people to work.
Okay, that's fine. What you're saying is it's important for you to know exactly what the temperature is when the bodies are discovered, and after that, if the temperature needs to be changed, then you have no objection to it being changed.
Yes, sir.
But it is important to know exactly what it is at the time the bodies are discovered.
Yes, sir.
And is it not generally true that if the temperature were to have been changed prior to your agents or investigators arriving, someone should tell them, hey, this is what it was and we've moved it down?
Yes, sir.
And that's pretty common in your business.
Yes.
And you expect on a good crime scene that that would be relayed to your people.
I would hope so, yes.
And that's when you were the medical examiner for the First Judicial Circuit, that's the way it ran, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you were there in 2015.
Yes.
Now, are you able to determine, and I may be asking you more TV questions than real questions, so correct me if I'm wrong, but are you able to determine on the cut marks on the necks as to whether the person is right-handed or left-handed?
No.
Can't you tell by the direction of the cut or the entry?
It would depend on where the assailant was standing in relation to the victim. If he's standing behind, it would change handedness if you actually stood in front.
Okay. What if they stood behind Voncile and John?
Behind,
What would be the direction?
you said Voncile and John?
Yes, ma'am.
Voncile's injury only went from the front to the back. So there really was not a left or a right deviation. John's went from front to back and downwards, but also left to right. So with John, it was left to right.
So
So
if you're behind John,
if
it
you're
would be a
be-
right-handed.
if you're behind John, I can picture that it would be easy to go left to right in a stabbing motion. Yes,
So it'd
with
be
the
a
right
right-handed
hand.
person
And that's speculation.
in front. It would be a left-handed person. Just the opposite if you're in front.
Well, it depends. You could still grasp it with your right hand in the front and pull it around towards the front of the person like that.
Then you really can't tell.
You really can't.
We're just guessing at this point.
Yeah, speculating.
Okay. So we can't tell that. Are you able to tell the height of the person who committed the damage to both Voncile and John?
No, because they both could have been seated when they were attacked.
You don't know if they were or they weren't.
That's correct.
As to Richard. Now, Richard was shot in, was it the right ear?
Yes,
In the right ear, and the bullet traveled subcutaneously,
correct.
and then it exited somewhere in the upper part of his neck.
Yes, the base of his scalp. Yeah.
Is there any way of, and was that wound was from at least 2 feet away?
Yes, it was.
You call that a distance wound.
I did.
But the distance could be 2 feet to infinity, I guess, when, in the way you gauge them, is that right?
That's correct.
So based upon that gunshot, can you tell whether the downward angle or how did that happen?
I can tell you that I measured the entrance was 5 inches from the top of the head, and in the exit was also 5 inches from the top of the head. So there really was no up or
So it
down.
was pretty straight.
Right.
So you couldn't tell the height of the person doing the shooting?
No, I would never say that. I mean, I would never be able to say the height. All that has to happen is the end of the barrel has to line up with that wound path and that wound direction. A person could be hanging from the ceiling and shoot someone and cause that same wound.
Could Richard have died from that gunshot wound?
If he could have died, it would have been not immediate, in my opinion. It would have been caused by swelling of the brain because of the force associated with the bullet going so close to his head. It's possible that he may have had such severe swelling of the brain that he may have passed.
Would the shock waves have done anything to him?
That's exactly what I'm talking about,
What
the
you're talking
shock
about, the
wave
shock wave.
of going past his skin and so close to the brain, and those shock waves may have affected his brain and caused injury and swelling.
Could they have knocked him out?
I believe so.
Voncile Smith weighed, I think you said, 234 pounds and was about 5'11", give or take.
Yeah, a little less than 6 feet, and she weighed 234.
That's a heavy person to move once they're deceased. did you see any marks on her wrists or her forearms or any drag marks on her chest that would be indicative of her being drugged down a hallway on carpet?
I saw on her skin a lot of drying because of the decomposition process.
Didn't she also have psoriasis?
Oh, I don't know. I only have that she has clinical history of diabetes, just like Richard, I think. I did notice on her right wrist that she had an abrasion, which is a scrape. You saw the injuries of the left palm, although that doesn't really fall in line with your description of what I'm looking for. She did have on the lateral left posterior leg, a small dried red abrasion. And the bottom of the right third toe had a small red abraded contusion. So it's not something that I could say with certainty, because sometimes the skin in its nature is to decompose, and that will hide drag marks and other injuries as well.
So you didn't see any when you did the autopsy?
Not so great that I could say, oh my gosh, take a look at this.
Generally, though, wouldn't you have drag marks if you were drugged down a carpet?
Well, you could, unless you're dragged on the carpet. Maybe just, that you're lying on the carpet and the carpet is the one that's moving.
With all this questioning being said and going on and on, you still can't say who did the murders of these three people?
No, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. I don't have anything further.
You're welcome.
Dr. Minyard, are you aware that the crime scene technicians are not allowed to move a body until someone responds from your office?
I'm aware of that rule, but I've also seen it broken many times.
Okay. Now, there was testimony that the deaths of John and Richard were pronounced at 11:14 a.m. and the death of Voncile was pronounced at 11:17 a.m. What time did your investigator arrive on scene?
My investigator arrived at 1600, so 4:00 p.m.
Okay, and then what time did your investigator record the body temperature of John?
She recorded the body temperature at 17:49, which is 5:49 p.m.
Okay, and then what about the body temperature for Richard?
(17:18), which is 5:18 p.m.
Okay, so your investigator didn't take the temperatures or record the temperatures until about 6 to 7 hours after they'd been pronounced deceased.
Correct.
Now, you talked about alcohol or ethanol. Does that necessarily mean that they were drinking alcohol, or where else do you see ethanol?
We see ethanol very, very commonly in decomposed people. It's the bacteria that start to go crazy after death, and it produces a sort of an internal alcohol.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Those are all my questions.
You're welcome.
All right, step down, Doctor.
Thank you, sir.
this time, the state would move into evidence State's Exhibit 382, which are the bank records of Donald Hartung, showing an ATM deposit of $100 on July 30th, 2015, and an ATM deposit on August 3rd, 2015 for $900. And I filed a notice of intent to rely on June 23rd, 2017.
No objection.
So admitted.
Mr. Ford, are all the state's exhibits moved into evidence?
Yeah.
Judge, at this time, the state rests.
All right, members of the jury, we're going to take a break at this time, at least like 20 minutes or so. Any response, State?
Judge, evidence viewed in the light most favorable to the state has put on a prima facie case of first degree murder on all three counts.
Judgment will be denied. What about any defense witnesses?
We're going to have some, if you give us a couple minutes, sure.
Okay, please state team, how many you have today?
Possibly two, Your Honor.
And you want me to inquire after those witnesses testify with Mr. Hartung?
I know we're going to have some tomorrow.
Okay, so probably two this afternoon. What generically would
Police procedures expert and a religion expert.
I can't, can you speak
I
up?
said police procedures and religion experts.
Already told. A couple.
Great.
Okay. All right, we'll be in recess until 5 minutes to 3.
I was going to say, Mr. Myers wanted to talk to one of the witnesses, so.
Very good.